A journey along Kentucky's Bourbon Trail takes the traveler through the towns of Claremont, Bardstown, and Loretto, then along the Bluegrass Parkway to Lawrenceburg and Frankfort. At Claremont, we'll stop at Jim Beam, then on to Heaven Hill in Bardstown. From Bardstown, we'll travel to Loretto, home of Maker's Mark. After a short drive on the Bluegrass Parkway, we find both Wild Turkey and Four Roses in Lawrenceburg. Then we'll finish up in Frankfort at Buffalo Trace. Each of the distilleries along the trail offers tours, either on a regular schedule or by appointment. Although a visit to any one distillery will give you an insight into the history of bourbon in Kentucky and the production process, after visiting several distilleries, you will begin to appreciate the way each product continues to be influenced by early traditions. So let's start our journey with just a little history and tradition from each of the 6 distilleries we'll visit during the next hour. Starting in Claremont, we'll visit with Gerry Dalton at Jim Beam.
Jim Beam was in the midst of that early distilling. He came across the mountains in 1788 and brought his wife, and fortunately for us, he also threw a copper pot still on board the wagon. And we don't know for sure what he did from 1788, but in 1795 we know that he sold his first barrel of whiskey. His son David and his son David M. Beam took over the company in turn, and then came the world-renowned James Beauregard Beam, Jim Beam, after whom the company is now named. He ran some before Prohibition, but a real indication of his dedication to the distilling business and to making fine whiskey is that at the end of Prohibition, at the advanced age of 70, I think is true, he built a working distillery in 120 days and launched on the current modern day Jim Beam distilling.
We go back when the Shapiro family first started Heaven Hill. They started building, I believe, in 1934, and the actual production that came off the still was in 1935. But they also had some cousins of ours that were Beams. So every barrel of whiskey that's been produced at Heaven Hill has been produced by Beam, over 4.5 million barrels. The company was owned by the 5 brothers, the Shapiro family. Then the Hommel family, which is Jeff Hommel, is part of the operation here. He's in charge of international sales and all of our sales operations. His family also dates back to being one of the long-time members of the operation. Anyway, that's sort of the 3 families that have been kind of meshed together and to form our operation, and we also are the only family operation of size that left in the industry today.
Now, the interesting thing about our history is that a lot of what happened was kind of out of the creative mind of Mr. Samuels, but his wife, Mrs. Samuels, doesn't get as much credit as he does because everyone really enjoys the whiskey. But it was his wife who actually came up and promoted the name and actually the look of our product. Mrs. Samuels was also a very unique person herself in that she liked to collect antiques and collect pewter and collect different things. Well, the pewter that she collected, at one time she had one of the best collections of English pewter in the United States. You know, a certain crafts group or people that would make this would make a mark on the bottom of the pewter that she would recognize and go after. Well, that became a kind of a signature thing, and even today you still see people who make glass molds. They put the mold making company on the bottom, or the Hummels that you see, people that indicate this was made by this craft group. She said to her husband, you know, TW, you need to put a mark on your bottle that indicates who made this bottle. And that's what you see in the SIV. That's the mark of the maker, hence the name Maker's Mark. The S stands for Samuels, He was the fourth generation commercial distiller. Star stands for Star Hill Farm, which this area is also known as Star Hill Farm. In addition to the name, Mrs. Samuels came up with the shape of the bottle. It was more of a brandy shape, because she was a brandy drinker in addition to drinking some of the bourbon that the family would make. But you'll notice it's more of a squatty bottle, not quite as tall and thin as a lot of whiskey bottles are. So it takes its shape from that. But the most unique thing that she did was create the idea of the wax. Mr. Samuels initially was an opponent of the wax. He couldn't envision in his mind people dipping this bottle by hand while it was going down a bottling line. Well, thank goodness Mrs. Samuels, like most wives, prevailed. And to this day, we still dip every bottle by hand. To this day, it's our patented look, and you'll even see a lot of our advertising. It's just the upper half of the bottle. And in Kentucky, that's all it takes for people to recognize Maker's Mark.
This distillery started around 1896 making bourbon, and at one time there were like 15 distilleries in this little stretch of land through here. This distillery was started by the Rippey brothers. They came over from Ireland and started making whiskey. 1950s was when Wild Turkey started, around 1950-51. Wild Turkey started, it was made in Kentucky for a man in New York. It was the Austin Nichols Company. They were a big wholesale grocer, spirits. They sold all sorts of different things. They did a wild turkey hunt with friends of theirs. Mr. McCarthy was the man that was doing this, and he went to his warehouse one day, and actually he was using this bourbon in a blended whiskey. Back in those days, a lot of it was straight whiskey, light whiskey, blended whiskeys. Bourbon wasn't real big as far as it is today. But when he got in a hurry getting ready to go on his wild turkey hunt, he just went to the warehouse and went to this one barrel, got it out and took it. Well, all of his buddies really enjoyed it. So when they went back next year to go to the wild turkey hunt, they wanted him to bring some of that wild turkey bourbon that he brought the year before. They went back to the warehouse, and it was the bourbon that he was having made here in Kentucky. And Mr. McCarthy never told anybody exactly who was making it. There's several people that will say it was made in Louisville, Kentucky, and that's probably true. He was having it contracted. But it turned out to be 8 years old, and when he proofed it, it was right around 101 proof. So when he took it back the second year, they decided, of course, he made a lot of money and he didn't make it by being dumb. He decided he would start producing this bourbon. Of course, he called it Wild Turkey Bourbon because that's where it started, was on wild turkey hunts. It was 8 years old, which was distinctive. Most bourbons are 4 or 5 years old, so an 8-year-old bourbon was distinctive. And the 101 proof was very distinctive. 80 proof is the lowest proof you can put in the bottle, so most bourbons are 80 proof. So he went with the 8-year-old 101, and for a while he had it made in Kentucky, had it distributed through New York. In 1971, Liggett Group bought Austin Nichols. They bought this distillery and started producing it here. So really that's when Wild Turkey really took off, because they put a lot of money behind promoting, advertising Wild Turkey. So they came here in 1971. Pernod Ricard bought this place and the brand in 1982, and they've owned it ever since. Pernod Ricard right now is the third leading spirits producer in the world. So we're just a small part. But they have let us keep on being a family type company. In all the bourbon industries, there are very family rich traditions in the distilling part of it.
Four Roses, the brand, was fostered by a man by the name of Paul Jones. And some of the early origins are kind of shrouded in mystery. There are a lot of stories about how Four Roses got its name. One of the more charming stories has to do with a man by the name of Paul Jones. And Paul apparently was smitten with a young Southern belle and told her that if she would wear a corsage on the night of the big gala, the big ball, that would be a sign that she would marry him. And of course we don't know whether she wore the corsage or not. Probably would have been a wrist corsage of the time, but we do know that that's been attributed to why it's been called Four Roses. So the name was very appealing at the time. At one time it was called America's most famous bouquet, or favorite bouquet. It started about 1865 in Georgia. It was moved to Louisville, Kentucky in the 1880s and trademarked in 1888. Mr. Jones was a pioneer as far as advertising was concerned. He had incandescent light signs that lit up at night advertising Four Roses. He traveled all over the place just trying to foster the brand and keep it going and get the whiskey sales made. He had a place on Whiskey Row in Louisville where he transacted his business. He did die in the late 1800s, and the business was taken over by his nephews and made to be even better. And from there on, it becomes sort of like a hand-to-hand operation. Some of the family ran it, some of it was run by corporation. And then by the end of World War II, it was probably the best-known American Kentucky bourbon in the world. So it has had a rich and varied history over the years. But at that time, a decision was made to sell it internationally on a big scale and kind of let the sales in the United States kind of travel off where they might. So in the late 1970s, early 80s, another resurgence took place to bring Four Roses back into the United States. And at that time, there was not much interest in it because there were a lot of things that were downplaying the bourbon industry. But the worldwide trade still kept going very well, and to the point now where we think it's good to move this back into the U.S. culture and see what we can do with it.
Well, particularly on Buffalo Trace, this Leestown was settled in 1775, and the Lee brothers came in and had with a small contingent of other people. And they were this was the first settlement north of the Kentucky River. And soon thereafter, somewhere around 1787, they first started making whiskey here. Now, Buffalo Trace traces our heritage back to that time. Somewhere in the 1880s, E.H. Taylor Jr. purchased and he called it OF. There were two distilleries here at that time. There was the OFC, Old Fire Copper, and there was Carlisle, who was named after a U.S. senator at the time. So there were two distilleries. They were both owned by E.H. Taylor Jr. And he did many things to modernize the distillery. He steam heated the warehouses to make the bourbon age through the winter, which it normally would not. When it gets cold, it doesn't age. So he steam heated. And then George T. Stagg was the next owner, and he was a famous whiskey person. We even have a bourbon named after him now, George T. Stagg, which we produce in limited quantities. Then I guess the next major happening was when Colonel Blanton came to work. He came to work in 1897 as a stock boy, and he rose to be the president and head person at this distillery. He built a lot of the warehouses. During his tenure, this Stony Point mansion was built. He built it, and he and his wife moved in 1934. And in 1936, he started building our current fermentation tanks and plants, our stills, our still house, our cooking rooms. He was, and occasionally he'd make a single barrel bourbon, and he would share it with certain friends of his. That's how we got the name of Blanton's Bourbon. Blanton in 1984, in honor of the Colonel, we started making commercially a single barrel bourbon. We were the first distillery to do that. In about 1991, Sazerac Corporation bought. It was known as the George T. Stagg Distillery up until that time. And then in 1999, we came out with our Buffalo Trace our flagship brand.
The history of bourbon is tied so directly to the history of Kentucky and the United States. It really starts with the first settlers, pioneers that came into, the explorers that came into the new continent, the Americas. They brought with them all their traditions of Europe, and some of those traditions were the making of alcoholic beverages, whether it be wine or beer, or from the English side and the Scottish side and the Irish side of making whiskeys.
When Thomas Jefferson was governor of Virginia, and Kentucky being part of Virginia, he wanted to encourage people to go out and settle the frontier. And so he promised any settler 400 acres of land if they would just come out here and grow 1 acre of corn. At the time, Kentucky was a land of massive hardwood forest. So clearing 1 acre of land was not exactly easy. But what happened was people took him up on the 400 acres. And once they cleared their acre of land, grew their corn, they had nobody to sell it to, because I'm growing my acre of corn, you're growing your acre of corn, and so everybody else is. We knew that if you put the corn on the back of the family mule, you could put about 4 to 5 bushels of corn. And so it wasn't really economically feasible to load up the mule and take him back east, because you weren't going to make enough money from the corn.
After the federal government was formed, the farmer distillers in Pennsylvania were informed that they were going to have a tax placed upon them, federal tax. So George Washington came along as President of the United States and tried to quell the rebellion. He put on a military uniform again, even as President of the United States. He was the first to do that, and sent more troops, or took more troops under the command of Light Horse Harry Lee, into the field in Pennsylvania to quell this rebellion against taxation. It was largely unsuccessful. There are some that say that it was fueled by Citizen Genet from France at the time, due to the fact that they were still trying to foment some antagonism against England. So a lot of these farmers mounted their stills onto flatboats and brought them west to avoid not only some kind of confrontation but the tax, and came into Kentucky and found a cereal grain here, maize, and began to make whiskey here.
And when they found all this corn, they said, well, you know, if you're going to put 4 to 5 bushels on the family mule and take it back east, why not distill it? And then that same mule can take the equivalent of 25 bushels of corn back east, albeit in a liquid form now, and you can sell it for a lot of money. And so that is why distillation started here. And it also happens that, if you're familiar with the bluegrass region of Kentucky, there's a huge limestone bowl just beneath the surface. And that's one of the reasons that the grass is blue, why we have the horses are so strong, because when the water comes through the limestone and the animals drink that, it really does a lot of good things for their bones. Well, it does the same thing for whiskey. The worst thing that you can do when you're making whiskey is have iron in the water. And this is a natural filtration to get the iron out of the water. And so you have limestone and rich water, which just happens to make extremely good whiskey.
And mind you, the whiskey that they made back then initially wouldn't be recognized as being bourbon. These days, initially they probably used a good bit more rye because they were used to making rye whiskey. Gradually they found a balance between corn and rye. We call rye small grains. They found a balance in that, but they were still making basically white whiskey.
Problem was, where was the marketplace? Well, most of the people were back east, except for those that were downstream. Downstream being down Ohio River, Mississippi down to New Orleans. So a lot of grain would go that way.
Generally speaking, they'd make it in the wintertime after the harvest, and then they'd wait till the flood season when the rivers were up to put it on the flatboats to move it down the Kentucky River here, or the Salt River, which is our major water source, and move it out to the Ohio River, where it went on to a steamer or a steamboat, and went down to New Orleans. And while it was going down to New Orleans, and that keg was about the only aging it ever received. So that's one of the ideas behind the term red eye, the idea that your eyes became red from drinking immature whiskey.
There's been several stories. Every distiller seems to have his different story on how the wood first got charred. For me, it's basically common sense. They were shipping fish, pickles, a little bit of everything up and down the rivers in wood barrels. I think this was affecting the taste of his whiskey, giving it flavor, so he decided one day to burn that taste out of there. So he burnt the inside of the barrel to get the taste out of it, and when he did that and put his whiskey in there, by the time it got to New Orleans and down in the South, it turned a little bit of color and gave it a little better flavor.
So the story goes that one of the farmers had some lumber in his barn that caught fire, and so anyway, he was going to make some barrels out of it, and after it got burned, he wasn't sure, so he used it anyway, put the whiskey in, shipped it down the river to New Orleans and from Kentucky, and found out, man, this is great stuff because it turned red, you know.
And what they didn't realize they were doing is there's sugar inherent in the wood, and when you burn it like that, that sugar is drawn in and it caramelizes and it forms a layer. We would put barrels of whiskey on flatboats, and about 6, 7, 8 months later, when it arrived in New Orleans, the people were raving about this amber spirit. And the people up here were thinking, you're all nuts, it's clear. But what they found out was that 8 months it spent on the water, it was migrating back and forth through the char layer and through the sugar layer, and it was picking up color and flavor, and the traditional white lightning or moonshine was being softened by the effects of aging in the wood. So I think it was very serendipitous that the barrels came to be used and were charred in the first place.
There was a large county that was called Bourbon. It comes from the French royal family, Bourbon family. And Bourbon County at that time encompassed a large area of what we now know as Kentucky, even though it was still a part of Virginia at that time.
Now, as a matter of interest, I get asked from time to time where the name Bourbon came from. And there was a shipping port at the mouth of the Kentucky River on the Ohio, where a lot of the products of the state got on flat boats and went downriver. And that was in Bourbon County, the old Bourbon County. The barrels were allegedly marked with initially with whiskey made in Bourbon County, Kentucky. And of course, I like to tell the folks that come around that I talk to that that whiskey went downstream and ended up in New Orleans or some such, Natchez. And when it did, I could see the patrons of a bar room on a Saturday night saying, "Give me some of that whiskey that was made in Bourbon County, Kentucky." And I think after 3 or 4 drinks, it probably said, "Give me some of that bourbon."
E.H. Taylor Jr. was a bourbon aristocrat, and at that time bourbon had gotten its name, it was well established, but there were a lot of imitators. Other firms were making corn whiskey, and they were not aging it at all. They were adding colors and flavors right off the still and watering it down and calling it bourbon. Well, E.F. Taylor Jr. was a purist. He knew that was not right. He did it the right way. He aged it in charred oak barrels like it was supposed to be. And no artificial coloring, of course, no artificial flavoring. And he worked very hard to get regulations, laws, passed through the state legislature, national legislature, to regulate the production of bourbon.
Bourbon must be a whiskey distilled from fermented mash of grain, must be at least 51% corn in the mash bill. It must be distilled at less than 160 proof, must be entered in a new charred oak container at less than 125 proof.
Well, to be a bourbon, all you have to do is go into the barrel, and you can come right back out and be a bourbon. To be a straight bourbon, as you know, you got to be in there for at least 2 years, and to be a Kentucky straight bourbon, it's got to be 2 years in Kentucky in a barrel. The other number is 4, that being that if your product's 4 years or less, you got to have that age statement on the side of the label.
We're a very old-fashioned distillery. Our parent company, no matter who's owned us, has let us do it the old-fashioned way. Jimmy Russell is as old-fashioned as they come. He wants to make the whiskey the same way Elijah Craig did back in the beginning. So if you come to Wild Turkey Distillery, you'll see that we're a very old-fashioned type distillery. Everything is very slow. Everything is done in an old-fashioned way.
We don't call ourselves small batch. We don't call ourselves single barrel. We're what we call is a handmade product. We have got a very small operation. We've got probably the ratio of employees to bottles is pretty high compared to most people in the industry. We'll only do probably about 535,000 cases, whereas some other people will do closer to 4 million, 5 million, 6 million cases a year. We do it all at this old little distillery. People come up and they can't believe that we're actually doing it at this small of a location. But it's because we've got some great people who really know what they're doing and make some quality stuff.
One of the proudest things we have making bourbon is that you cannot do anything to it that add water to reduce the proof. You cannot add coloring, you cannot add flavoring. So the product we make and put in that barrel when it comes out, that's what we got to use. Any other whiskeys, scotches, Irish whiskeys, Canadian whiskeys, straight whiskeys, they can add coloring or flavoring to make it to what they want.
If you say blended in our parlance here, that indicates that you're making an alcoholic beverage that has aged whiskeys in it, neutral grain alcohol, might have also some caramel and some wine in it to make it into a suitable product. With that in mind, you can stretch a lot of aged whiskeys, and they did a lot of that after World War II, because there wasn't a lot of aged whiskeys due to the fact that they'd made a lot of alcohol for the war effort.
I'm proud that it is a distinctive American product, but also that we cannot do anything to fix it up to make it better. There's nothing artificial about it at all.
Well, Master Distiller at Buffalo Trace is responsible for the acquisition of the grain, the quality of the grain, and the milling, the cooking, fermentation, distillation, and final aging of the bourbon whiskey to the point where it's ready to be processed for bottling.
The Master Distiller is chief cook and bottle washer of the actual production. He oversees the specs for the grain. Also, he actually sees the grain each and every day of the operation. He makes sure that the temperatures, the cooking, the recipe is followed to his spec. He also looks at the distilling equipment every day, makes sure it's functioning, and he follows it all the way until it's entered into the barrel.
When I first started, the Master Distiller was your plant manager, your distiller, your human resource person, your union representative that took care of union deals. He basically did everything. Nowadays, with the companies that have got bigger, the Master Distiller, he's just more in charge of making his product, making sure it's good, tasting the product, getting it ready to be bottled, picking out the barrels to be put in the bottle.
Consistency is what a Master Distiller strives for. He looks for consistency day in and day out. If it's 7 days a week, that's mostly what bourbon production consists of, because you've always got something in process. So it's a 7 day a week nurturing and hands-on process that the Master Distiller is in charge of, because when it comes down to it, when it gets to the consumer and it goes and it's in the bottle, that's where he's judged. And I think that's where the single barrels and some of the premiums that brought the Master Distillers more into play as a work of their arts.
Well, to become a Master Distiller, there's really no course you can take in college or or no technical school you can go to. It's a matter of just understudying someone that's already has been a master distiller, and that's the way I became a master distiller, was about 3 years of understudy of my predecessor. And from that point on, I took over, and of course, you continue to learn as you go along, and even after 35 years, you're still learning, or I am anyway.
In our business, there is no official way to become a master distiller. There's no class that you can take. It's usually just given hands-on, handed down from generation of distiller to distiller. And so you can be a distiller in training for quite a few years until the opportunity arises for you to actually put into practice everything that you've learned.
I've had all sorts of jobs here at Wild Turkey. I started out actually in the union, dumping bottles, rolling barrels, doing things like that. And it was really a big help when I got into the management part of it, this master distiller part of it, because I knew everything about it. The first job I went into was in the distillery, learning how to make the whiskey. I spent 8 or 9 years over there learning the recipe, learning the formulas, learning what it needed to taste like coming right off the still, because that's completely different than the finished product. I'd tasted a little of the finished product before I came here, but never the white dog, as we call it. Then I came up to the maturation part of it to learn how to make sure it's aging right, what you need to do if something's a little bit wrong with it. So I've been in that for 8 or 10 years now too. So I've been working alongside Jimmy Russell for going into 24 years now.
I'm named after my grandfather, which is part of the Jim Beam family. Jim Beam and my grandfather, Park Beam, were brothers. Then my grandfather actually was a distiller in the family. Jim was more in the financial management end, setting up the operation. Then my father, my uncles came along and they learned the business from their father. And then I followed my father here at Heaven Hill, which he came here from Beam in 1946, I believe, or 47. And then I've learned the business under him. Then now I'm teaching the next generation, my son, to be a master distiller.
It's the time-honored traditions of the little small secrets of making your unique bourbon a certain way.
If you wanted to paint a big picture of the distilling process, the bourbon making process, it'd probably break down into 6 major steps. The first of which would be grain handling, grain receiving, and milling. The second step would be mashing. Then comes fermentation. Distillation follows that. Then we have entry and aging into the warehouse. And finally we come out of the warehouse and we have bottling to put the product on its way to the ultimate consumer.
The very first thing we do when we start making bourbon is getting our grains. The government says it has to be a 51% corn mixture to be called a bourbon. That's a government regulations. Most people's going to be between 70 and 80%. Our grain qualities are stricter than the federal government, so we use very high quality grains in our process.
And our grain comes from Indiana for the corn, the rye comes from the western United States, the malt comes from Minnesota. That grain is chosen for its flavor qualities, its appearance, and its lack of mold, mildew, or must. These are 3 qualities that won't transfer out of the grain or the final product when it comes off the still.
We have the smallest batch size in the business, our bushels being about 216 bushels per mash. We're also unique because in our industry, the traditional mash bill is corn, rye, and malt. And Mr. Samuels in 1953 decided that he wanted to try and change his old family recipe. And so Mr. Samuels substituted in our mash bill, it's 70% corn. Of course, it has to be at least 51% to be considered a Kentucky bourbon. And we have 70% corn, we have 16% wheat, and it's soft red winter wheat. It's grown in a 40-mile radius of this distillery here in Kentucky. We try to get all of our grains, except for our malt, in Kentucky. And we use 14% malt, as everybody has to use a little bit of malt, because of the enzymes and the things that are in there that help us in the conversion of starches.
We buy the best grade corn that we can get, which is #1 yellow. And even though it is fairly clean when we get it, we also take it through a cleaning step. We have a cleaner, and that removes any cobs or foreign material or excess dust, things of that nature. And after the cleaning process, it goes into a silo and it's held there until it's ready to be used.
Then when we're ready to actually use the grain, it'll be milled to a sort of a cross between flour and cornmeal.
And we do something just a little different than the other guys, and you'll see this when we go out on tour. You'll see the roller mill, the old-fashioned way of grinding grain. We still use a series of rollers that are kind of rubbing together, and they get closer together as you go down through it, and it grinds it in more of a shearing fashion.
We use hammer mills to mill our grain as opposed to roller mills. The hammer mills are easier to repair. The fingers can be easily replaced. The grain is actually flung against a screen that has a hole opening to allow the corn, for example, to be sheared into a meal rather than into a face powder quality. We have two mills, one's for the corn, one's for the rye and the malt. For obvious reasons, they are smaller grains.
Everybody likes a different consistency on their grains, so that in turn makes the difference in the viscosity of the mash and how much gallon per bushel. That's where it really gets down to the distiller's preference, what he thinks is going to make the best product.
When we go into the mash tub, which would be the next step of the process, we start off, as a lot of distillers do, by putting in the liquid ingredients first. In Kentucky, one of the reasons that all the bourbon distilleries are in Kentucky, because you can make bourbon anywhere in the United States. You don't have to just make it in Kentucky. The question you have to ask yourself is, why are they all here? Well, one of the reasons is because of the limestone water. So we start off with putting our limestone water into the mash tub. We then follow it up with our back set, or as they call it, the setback, which is some recycle that we pull from the previous day's fermentation that's already gone through the still, and minus the salts, and put it back in. Now, sour mashing is a process term. It's not a classification. So when you sour mash, you're actually doing something that enhances the quality. Most good bourbons are sour mash. You don't have to be a bourbon.
The sour mash process is attributed to Dr. James Crow, and sometime between 1820 and 1840 he developed this process. But back in those days, sanitation was a big problem, and if you had a wild bacteria or a wild yeast growing in your fermentation, you just didn't do all that well, either in quality or quantity of bourbon. And the sour mash process helps to controls the pH and also controls the growth of some bacteria.
We then put in our corn and we cook it, and the whole purpose of this is just to boil the corn, boil the grains, and start breaking down these starches. It's kind of like making something on the stove. It's not it's not rocket science after all. We're just making whiskey.
Once we get that done, we start cooling the mash down. Once you get it down to about 170 degrees, we add rye. Rye is basically a flavor additive. There's a little starch content, but it's basically a flavor additive. 99% of the bourbons use rye. There is a few that use wheat instead of rye that make a sweeter type bourbon. But for the old-fashioned distiller, he wants that big, bold bourbon taste, which the rye gives you. We'll cook that for about 15 minutes, bring it down to around 145 or 50 degrees, and add our barley malt. What the barley malt does for you is it has an enzyme reaction with the starch and converts it into sugar. So that's basically what we're doing. We're making sugar water. If you're the old-time moonshiner, you're taking sugar and water to make your alcohol with. And that's how they used to catch a lot of the old moonshiners. If they were coming into the store and buying 600 pounds of sugar, they knew they wasn't making that much jam and jelly, so they had to be doing something. So the revenuers, they'd follow them back into the hills and find their stills.
One, we want to free the starch up in the grain, and two, we want to convert it to sugar. It's the sugar that gets used in the next step of the process.
Yeast cannot act on starch, it has to be in the form of simple sugars. So after the conversion step, then we cool it down further to fermentation temperature, which is around 68 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Then it's pumped into the fermenting tank, and a predetermined amount of yeast is added. And we also recycle some of the day's distillation strained spent beer, which is called stillage or setback. That is the sour mash process. That goes into the fermenter with the mash and the yeast.
And it's important to note that one of the things that makes different distilleries different is the different yeast that they use. And the one thing that we do guard pretty close is our yeast. We do keep it locked up in a walk-in box so that door doesn't get left open, the yeast doesn't die, and also so it stays our yeast. If you were to put somebody else's yeast into our fermentation system, you would get a different tasting alcohol at the still.
We are using the same strain of yeast that Jim Beam isolated at the end of Prohibition. We carefully propagate that yeast from year to year, and we carefully protect it and preserve it.
And actually, from what I've been able to determine, this particular strain of yeast has been preserved over the last approximately 60 years and has been used in making our bourbons since sometime in the 30s, and it might have been even as far back as the end of Prohibition. That I don't know, but I know it's at least 60 years old.
We have yeast cultures that Jimmy's had that were here when he came here 50 years ago. We use make our own yeast daily. We take it from that original yeast, cultures from that original yeast from 50 years ago, and start our yeast each time we start distilling.
Our yeast is ready to go in and start to eat the sugars and make more yeast, and along the way give off byproducts. One of those byproducts being the alcohols that are going to go and make our product taste the way it does. Primarily ethyl alcohol, but there's other flavoring alcohols that are called fusel oil alcohols.
Now, each fermenter is composed of a coil inside of either a red cypress fermenter or a stainless steel fermenter. And that coil is energized by a temperature probe that when that liquid, which is set at a low temperature, goes to a high temperature, it maintains it at that high temperature until fermentation is complete.
The fermentation in this business is unique to distilling, that being different from beer, because we actually use a yeast that is very hardy and robust and can ferment fairly quickly. Most beer fermentations will take about 2, at the most part 3 weeks, where ours will take 3 to 4 days.
At the end of that process, what we have in the fermenter we call Distillers beer. It truly is beer because one of the byproducts of the yeast working is carbon dioxide, which is the fizz in beer. There's the mash solids are in there, and by that time the fermentation is up to probably 9 or 10% alcohol. That'll vary from distillery to distillery.
Then once you ferment, you got to take that mash somewhere, and once it's got the right pH ranges you've worked it down to, you better get it to the still. Most stills and stillage equipment is designed by the master distiller within a given plant, where he likes to take what we call reflux in the process, where he likes to take his products off the columns or the stills, and also how many distilling processes take place within the given distilling of the product. All those are variances that fall on the master distiller shoulders.
The distiller's beer is pumped over to a holding tank, something we call a beer well, and from there it goes into the first of 2 steps of distillation here at Beam. In the first step, it is run through what we call, surprisingly enough, the beer still.
So from the beer well, it runs into the beer still, and it runs in at the top around the 14th plate. The plates all have holes with weirs on either side of them, and that liquid kind of forms a seal on top of each plate as it goes to the bottom of the still. While it's doing that, we're sending live steam up through the bottom of the beer still. It carries out the alcoholic vapor, which is a relatively low boiler.
And we're not done there though. Our first distillation will come off at 120 proof, from which we'll take that and to a doubler, which is like a pot still, the old-fashioned pot still, with the fluted neck, which gives great reflux, gives great flavors, and come off at our second distillation at 130 proof. The regs say you got to stay under 160. Different distilleries come off at different proofs, and again, it's all about making different products. Great Kentucky bourbons, which is really the great thing about all these different distilleries, is there's a variety of great products that come out of each one of them.
Once that alcohol comes off, it's a clear white liquid. It tastes a lot like old moonshine liquor. It's a corn liquor at that point. Actually, I could not even sell it to you as a bourbon. It has to go in a new oak barrel that's charred on the inside.
The high wines, as we call the product of that second stage of distillation, go up to what we call the Cistern Room, and there the high wines are reduced to the appropriate proof for entry into the barrel. That's what we call it when we put it in a barrel. Bourbon, by regulation, cannot be entered at over 125 proof. So we'll reduce our high wines to that proof or less with very pure water, and those barrels are then removed from the Cistern Room and taken over to one of our many warehouses and stored for the period of time required for the particular product.
That's where I guess the old magic still starts to happen, because inside that barrel there's just a complexity of different things that are going to happen. The barrel itself has to be new, never been used for anything else. The barrel's got to be made out of oak, and in this industry we use white oak primarily. And probably most importantly, is that barrel has to have been charred, burned, set on fire for anywhere from 30, 40, 50, 60 at the most seconds, where it creates a layer of caramel as it burns the sugars that are inside that barrel.
We get all of our barrels from Kentucky. Jimmy specifies that the wood comes from eastern Kentucky or Missouri to make those arcs, to make sure that he gets the right type of wood. And we inspect the barrels every day. That's a big part of it. It only takes me 3 or 4 days to make my alcohol, but once I put it in the barrel, for us it's going to be at least 6 years before we use it.
We like the 7-story high warehouses. We think we get a lot of good aging with that type building. We open the top floors, we open the windows on the top floors, we open the windows on the bottom, and it creates a chimney effect. So you just draw the air through. Good airflow creates a lot of good aging.
We do have several different types of warehouses. Some of the older distilleries are limited to just rack houses, which are the classical old tall 7 to 9 story houses that you see dotted around every distillery. We have something called a palletized house, which is a modern house that holds a lot more whiskey, and we're able to enter it with a lot less of the labor intensity associated with rolling barrels. So a certain amount of our bourbon is stored in palletized houses, but we also hold on to the rack houses because we know how to commingle the various whiskeys from the various areas to produce the absolute product standard that we have for any of our products.
Another reason there's so many distilleries in Kentucky is because of the climate we have. The summers are beautiful, but they can be warm. The fall and the spring can be mild, but they're unpredictable too. And the winters typically are cool, or cold is a better way to say it. And these differences in temperature really help, because it's those temperatures that cause the whiskey to go into the wood and extract. So we put our barrels at the top of the warehouse for the first half of its life. But we don't leave it up there too long, because if we did, we'd get too much. The next thing you know, you would be kind of going over the edge. You'd be pulling too much of a good thing. So after about 3 summers, we'll actually sample the barrels, pop the bung out of there. We use a walnut bung, which is a little bit easier to get out than the poplar wood bungs. And take that whiskey, sample it, and if it looks like it's approved or okay for rotation, take them from the top and put them in the bottom. This is called a whiskey thief, and it's like a big straw. Put your finger over the top of it, and it fills up with whiskey, and be able to pull it out. It's not going to be very dark. That just shows you that the whiskey itself is going to look and improve over time. Somewhere around 100 and maybe at this point about 12, 13 proof, because it's been sitting up here in this heat and a lot of water started to evaporate out of that barrel. Still some sour notes there. It's not picked a lot of the sweetness that's going to come over the next 4 years. Now it's going to be rough. Is it rough? Yeah, is right. That is that's probably the best way to describe whiskey that's not ready is whew.
Yeah.
And I mean, it doesn't take great expertise to know when it's immature.
And that's a big part of a master distiller. He's tasting his whiskey all the time to make sure it's aging right. Make sure there's not something wrong with it. You might need to move it around in the warehouse if it's not aging quick enough or it's aging too quickly. So you're watching those things. So you're really taking care of that stuff for that 6 or 8 years that it's sitting in the warehouse.
I guess maybe you've heard about what's called the angel share. Actually, what happens during aging is that the barrels are porous and some of the liquid will evaporate through the wood. And although there's anywhere from 8 to 10% loss of the actual barrel content the first year, then each year thereafter, somewhere in the neighborhood of 3% evaporation loss. And that's what's called the angel share because of the liberation of this into the atmosphere.
But it all starts with the whiskey that you put into the barrel. You can enhance it, but you can't make bad whiskey better by putting it into a barrel.
After aging, the bourbon's removed from the house and taken down to what we call regauge, and there the bungs are bored out of the barrels and they're dumped into the dump trough and carried off for bulk storage. Then, when it's time to actually produce a given bottling, we'll do whatever filtration steps that we use on a particular product, reduce it to the appropriate proof for bottling, and it'll go off to our bottling house to be put in the final package for the consumer. We're very careful about how we select bourbon for even white label, which is the #1 selling bourbon in the world. Got to tell you that, we're proud of it. But our small batch bourbons that we're also very proud of, Knob Creek, Basil Hayden, Baker's, Booker's, those 4 bourbons, we go through a selection process there that starts off with our general taste panel. They will rank whiskeys and pick the best.
There is no laws concerning small batch bourbons. You can say you can dump 2,000 barrels and call it a small batch bourbon. For us at Wild Turkey, Our regular 101, we dump about 1,000 barrels, but what we call our small batch, which is our rare breed, our Russell's Reserve, we're going to dump about 100 barrels at a time. So in that 100 barrels, you're not going to be able to hide an average barrel. For our rare breeds the same way, and in the Kentucky Spirit there is laws concerning single barrel whiskey. It actually has to come from one single barrel. You fill as many bottles as you can, and that's all you can put in those bottles and call that a single barrel. And then you get the next barrel, fill as many bottles as you can. And that, for us at Wild Turkey, it's a very hands-on product. There's a neck wrap that goes around that they actually sit there and write what warehouse it came out of, what rick, rail, and floor it came off of. So our Kentucky Spirit, when I get out promoting Wild Turkey, that's one of the biggest questions I get is, what's your best product? Well, if you looked at the price and what you're doing, your Kentucky Spirit should be. That is a single barrel, so you're picking out some of your very best barrels to go in that. We also have a rare breed, which is a barrel-proof whiskey, which means you dump it out, filter the char out of it, and put it in a bottle. For us, our barrel-proof is 108 or 9 proof. A lot of distilleries, their barrel-proof will be 126 or 7, because legally you cannot put it in a barrel higher than 125 proof. I know when I talk about the tasting part of it, when I'm around people, you know, they think that's a wonderful job, and it is. I wouldn't give it up for anything. But if we get a complaint sample back, the first thing they're going to look at is who tasted that whiskey and okayed it to go out the door. So you want to be very, very careful on saying yes. You can't let the production part of it influence what you're tasting. If it tastes a little bad, or it's just average and it's going in your top shelf bourbons, then you've got to say no.
But we do that especially carefully so that we can ensure that we supply an absolutely consistent, if you like Knob Creek this year, 2 years from now, unless your tastes change, you'll still like Knob Creek because it'll be statistically indistinguishable from earlier batches. So we're proud of that.